We have 2 videos left in our Parts of the Brain series, and this one is all about the cerebral cortex. We're going to label all of the parts of the cerebral cortex that you're responsible for right now, but we're only going to talk today about the 4 lobes. In our next video, we're going to talk about the language areas and also the motor and somatosensory cortex. So just like we've done in our other videos, pull up your notebook and let's start off with some labeling. I want to make a note. You will see that there are lines in your notebook where I'm pointing to right now. On those lines, you should only have the names of the 4 lobes. The other areas that are filled in here that you see in different colors, we'll fill in a minute, but let's focus first on the 4 lobes. So the frontal lobes, picture your eye sockets being right here. These are your frontal lobes. So right in the front of your brain are your frontal lobes. Right behind the frontal lobes sits the parietal lobes. Remember, you have a lobe in each hemisphere of the brain. So on the right and the left, you have frontal lobe and a parietal lobe. Here's the parietal lobe sitting right behind the frontal lobe. In the way back, if you were to go in through your eyes and shoot straight back, you have your occipital lobe, which is where your visual cortex is. And then on the side of your head, right where your ears are, is your temporal lobe. Now this is going to make it easy to remember that the temporal lobe is responsible for hearing. Frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. Now if we switch down here to what's called the dorsal view of the brain, we're looking at the brain from overhead. Literally overhead, over your head, on top of your head. From front to back, we have the frontal lobes, parietal lobes, occipital lobes, and we cannot see the temporal lobes because they're on the sides of the head. I want you to take note of this structure right here called the corpus callosum. We're going to talk a little bit about this in a later video, a little bit today as well. But just make a note of it, is a bundle of nerve fibers that connects the 2 hemispheres to one another so that the hemispheres can essentially talk to one another. The language areas of the brain. We have Broca's area here located in blue. It's responsible for language production in the frontal lobe. And in the temporal lobe, we have Wernicke's area responsible for language comprehension. In the frontal lobe, right at the back of the frontal lobe, before this fissure or this very deep groove, is the motor cortex. The motor cortex, we're going to learn, is responsible for our voluntary movement. It's what allows me to move my mouth when I speak and move my hands when I'm writing, when I'm typing on a keyboard, etc. And in the parietal lobe, but in the front of the parietal lobe, sitting right behind frontal lobes, is the somatosensory cortex, which is responsible for our perception of touch sensation. So now we'll delve into the lobes. This is just another view of what we were just looking at. We've got frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and you also see the primary motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex. This makes up what is called the cerebral cortex. And if you look down here, we'll see the cerebellum, the pons, the medulla, and the spinal cord. So we see some of the parts of the brainstem that we've already learned about. The cerebral cortex is your body's ultimate control center because it's where basically all of your sensation and your perception and your higher order thinking is occurring. It's where all of this information is being integrated. A mnemonic that, again, is not mine. Imagine a Texas hat on your head, which is covering the outermost part of your brain, the cortex, get it, Texas. Amy amygdala, if you remember her, tries to prevent Tex from doing his job. So when you are super aroused, when you're super scared, when you're super anxious, it actually interferes with the ability of your cerebral cortex, particularly your frontal lobes, to function properly. So if you ever get really worked up and you find yourself just unable to think clearly, you can thank Amy because she's preventing cortex from being able to do his job. The corpus callosum connects the two hemispheres of the brain, right and left. We will talk about this a little bit more when we get to, when we talk about split brain patients. Split brain patients are patients who, because of epilepsy or seizure disorder, severe seizure disorder, have had to have the connection or this corpus callosum between their hemispheres severed so that seizures don't spread from one hemisphere to another. So we'll talk a little bit more about the implications of severing this corpus callosum, rendering the hemispheres unable to communicate with one another when we discuss split brain patients. Frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. These are the four lobes. Here's the mnemonic. Freud tore his pants off. That's kind of goofy, but there you go. So the frontal lobe is where all of our complex thinking occurs. So our ability to assess risks, to plan, to make decisions, to problem solve takes place in the frontal lobe. All of those functions are often known as executive functions. Just think about the CEO or the chief executive officer of a country a company is in charge of that company, making the decisions for the company, for example. Same goes your frontal lobes, which are responsible for your executive functioning. A mnemonic, use the front door as your mnemonic for this. So put the front door on your forehead and put Einstein, a complex thinker, behind the door. Your complex thinking is done thanks to your frontal lobes. Now, we're going to learn that in the teen brain, the prefrontal cortex is actually the very last part of the brain to develop. The cortex develops from back to front. So your prefrontal cortex, which is really responsible for things like your risk assessment, your ability to make good decisions, is not fully developed until you're in your mid-20s. Hence the reason why teenagers sometimes lack the ability to make good decisions. It's no fault of your own. It's just biology. Interestingly, though, your amygdala and the reward pathways of your brain develop earlier. So the mnemonic they sometimes use is, it's like you're given access to the gas pedal, but without being able to put on the brakes. But we'll talk more about the teen brain. Temporal lobe is where the auditory cortex is located. It's where auditory processing occurs. In the next unit, when we learn all about the ear and how auditory information is processed and kind of the biology of hearing, we'll learn more about the temporal lobe. Use tempo as your mnemonic. Picture a metronome above your ear where the temporal lobe is located, or you can also just simply remember temporal lobe on the side of your head where your ears are located, and it's responsible for auditory processing or hearing. The parietal lobe, which sits right behind the frontal lobe, is responsible for processing touch sensation and also visual information relative to spatial orientation. So it's what allows us to have an awareness of where objects are located in space. So if I were to close my eyes and navigate a room, I have a sense of where things are located. That kind of spatial awareness is a product of our parietal lobe. Use a piranha, parietal, fish as your mnemonic. The piranha bites you on top of the head where the parietal lobe is located, and that's a sensation that of pain that would be processed by the parietal lobe. And the occipital lobe. If you were to start from your eyes and shoot straight back, you land in your occipital lobe where your visual cortex is located. And we'll learn also in the next unit all about the anatomy of the eye and also the process of vision. How light energy comes in through the eye is turned into an action potential back here on your retina, and that information is sent back to the visual cortex in the occipital lobe where vision is processed, allowing you to see. You don't see with your eyes, you see with your brain. A helpful mnemonic, use the oc part of the word occipital and imagine an octopus and picture eyeballs instead of suckers on the tentacles. And maybe that'll help you remember the occipital lobe.